Hello and welcome to today's edition of Africa Day. I am your host, Tendai Pilatwe. In this lesson, we will explore the history of Southern Africa and the significance of major cities like Zimbabwe to ancient trade networks. Then, we'll test your understanding with a summary. Africa has a south. Guess what? That's right, Africa has a south. It's more than just the nation of South Africa. In history and archaeology, we tend to spend a lot of time talking about the northern parts of Africa. I mean, in some ways it makes sense. There's some cool stuff up there. For example, Egypt. And while Northern Africa had some incredible civilizations, it wasn't like societies stopped developing south of the Sahara Desert. In Southern Africa, an entirely different set of societies thrived. They looked different than large northern cities like Egypt or Kush or Aksum, and had their own ways of life. Some of the greatest southern cultures were centered on the people of Zimbabwe. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe The Kingdom of Zimbabwe was one of the greatest civilizations during the Iron Age of Southern Africa. Zimbabwe was a descendant of another Southern African culture, the Kingdom of Mapungubwe. This was the first major civilization of Southern Africa, which rose around 1075, most likely in response to increased demand for the trade items of the region. Mapungubwe was the first known culture in Southern Africa to have a class-based society with low-level farmers, middle-class administrators, and high-class nobility. They also introduced advanced stonework to the region and built stone walls around their buildings. In the 13th century, rulers from Mapungubwe moved to the Zimbabwe Plateau and founded the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. For the next 200 years, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe was a dominant power in Southern Africa. They incorporated over 150 cities as tributaries, meaning the cities paid taxes to the king. The Zimbabwe were a lot like the Mapungubwe. They had a strict class system where talented stonemasons and participated in the trade economies of Africa. However, where Mapungubwe had been a participant in trade, Zimbabwe dominated the market in Southern Africa. At the time, several cities had grown along the east coast of Africa. These cities, called trading cities because their economies were almost entirely dependent on trade, facilitated the incredible, lucrative international exchange that ran through the Northern Africa. Since they were near the intersection of the Mediterranean, Arabian, and Red Seas, these ports were able to access trade routes that connected to Rome, Persia, India, and even China. Additionally, they traded the valuable products of Africa, most notably gold and ivory. These products came from the interior of Africa, and Zimbabwe controlled that market. By trading African gold and ivory to the northeastern ports, Zimbabwe became incredibly wealthy, and products from as far as Arabia and Asia could be found in Zimbabwe courts. Around 1430, a Zimbabwean prince named Nyatsimba Mutota sailed north to find salt mines and conquered enough territory that he started the Kingdom of Mutapa. Mutapa was closer to the eastern trading cities and had access to valuable copper trade routes. Within a single generation, it became so powerful that it turned into an empire and the dominant political and economic power of Southern Africa. By 1450, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe was all but abandoned, forgotten in the shadow of Mutapa. Great Zimbabwe. At their height, the people of Zimbabwe introduced advanced society and masonry into Southern Africa. Nowhere was this most exemplified than in the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, a city called Great Zimbabwe. As the kingdom grew into the 13th century, so did the city. It was a powerful economic center that regulated the gold and ivory trade with partners across the world, spanning over 170,000 acres and housing up to 18,000 people, easily making it one of the largest ancient cities of Southern Africa. The city of Great Zimbabwe predates the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, and local people may have first started building back in the 11th century, 200 years before it became the center of the new kingdom. One of the things that made Great Zimbabwe so remarkable was its stone masonry. Stonework was not overly common in Southern Africa. Only Mapungubwe seems to really have rallied on stone architecture. Before Great Zimbabwe is full of stone buildings, including houses, temples, defenses, and possibly even observatories for watching the stars. One edifice called the Great Enclosure features stone walls that stretched up 36 feet tall and 820 feet long, easily making it the largest structure of ancient Southern Africa. To make them even more impressive, the mighty stone structures of Great Zimbabwe were made without mortar. Mortar is a substance that is used to hold stones in a wall together. To construct buildings without mortar, the stones have to be very precisely cut and perfectly shaped so that they can fit together naturally and will not budge. After Great Zimbabwe was abandoned with the rest of the kingdom, the city fell into ruins, leaving behind only the remains of the great stone buildings. Lesson summary. Let's summarize what we've learned. Southern Africa has an incredible history of its own, complete with complex societies that lived by their own set of rules. In ancient times, one of the greatest of these civilizations was the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was founded by the rulers of another ancient kingdom, Mapungubwe, which was probably the first culture in Southern Africa to use class system based social structure, and one of the first to really use stone architecture. Zimbabwe built upon these traditions and developed complex civilization that focused on mediating trade, while the northern cities facilitated trade routes between the Mediterranean, Red, and the Arabian Seas. Zimbabwe controlled the access to the highly desired African ivory and gold markets. With these products, Zimbabwe was involved in trade networks that stretched into Persia, India, and even China. Their capital city, the Great Zimbabwe, featured advanced stone masonry, with temples, palaces, and other buildings made almost entirely from stone. The Great Enclosure, a great edifice of Great Zimbabwe, was the largest structure of ancient southern Africa. Zimbabwean structures were built without mortar, a substance to hold uneven stones together. So the stonework had to be extremely precise, indicating their high level of skill. Eventually, Zimbabwe was replaced by an even more powerful southern trading center called Mutapa, and the Kingdom of Mutapa was abandoned in the 15th century. Nevertheless, Zimbabwe had set important precedents, and Southern Africa remained an important economic center for the ancient world. Thank you very much for your time, and see you in the next edition.